Hello, and welcome to today's discussion. I am Russ Feingold, the president of the American Constitution Society, America's largest progressive legal network, and today's discussion is guns and democracy. What's at stake in the 2024 election? In recent years, ACS has observed an undeniable and disturbing rise in political violence. In 2011, Congresswoman Gabby Giffords was shot in the head during an attempted assassination in Tucson, Arizona. In 2021, armed rioters stormed the Capitol to prevent the peaceful transfer of power. And of course, during the campaign cycle, former President Trump has been the target of not one, but two attempted assassinations. Now, having served in the United States Senate for 18 years, I have to emphasize, this isn't normal. Vigorous disagreement has always been a part of the political process. But when disagreements give way to violence and intimidation, our very democracy is at risk. And that's why I'm proud to co-host this important conversation along with March for Our Lives and Giffords Law Center, two incredible organizations who are on the front lines of the movement to address and prevent gun violence. Our conversation will be in the capable hands of Makennan McBryde, a legal project manager representing Giffords, and Yvin Shin representing March for Our Lives. Makennan is a legal project manager at Giffords Law Center, where she guides efforts to defend common sense gun laws in the courts and to hold the gun industry accountable for its role in the gun violence epidemic. Yvin advances similar efforts at March for Our Lives, where she writes amicus briefs centering the stories of gun violence survivors. They'll be joined by Joseph Blocher, a distinguished professor of law at Duke University, and Mary McCord, executive director of the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection at Georgetown. And these are two leading experts on the Second Amendment, guns, and the law. So on behalf of ACS, I'm deeply grateful to all of you for your time and expertise and excited to hear your insights. With that, I'll turn it over to Yvin and Makennan to get the discussion started.
Thank you so much, Russ, for the kind words and great introduction. And thank you for taking the time to join us this afternoon. And as well, a thank you to all of you for joining us in the audience. My name is Makennan McBryde. And on behalf of Giffords Law Center, March for Our Lives, and our incredible panelists we will be introduced to shortly, I want to thank you for joining us for what will hopefully be as entertaining as is pertinent of a conversation on how guns are both shaping and threatening our democracy. I want to say at the outset that we will have a Q&A portion at the end of the event, so please feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A function of the webinar. We will try to get to as many as possible at the end. I know this is a really interesting topic, and I'm sure there's lots of people want to hear about. And with that, I want to pass it to my co-host and co-panelist and a former co-worker in a fairly recent past life, Yvin Shin, to introduce herself and the panelists.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Makennan, for kicking us off. I'm Yvin Shin. I'm a legal associate project manager at March, and we are so excited to dive into today's panel on the topic of guns and democracy. We are going to be covering a host of topics that are incredibly and increasingly pertinent to American politics and democracy, including, but certainly not limited to, the threat of armed paramilitaries, white supremacy, and hate crimes committed with firearms, the January 6th attack on the Capitol, the chilling effect of guns on other rights like free speech, the Supreme Court and the Second Amendment, and the potential fate of gun regulations, ATF administrative action, and the White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention. I am so excited to hear what our fantastic panelists have to say about these topics. So without further ado, let's jump right in. So Professor Blocher, this first question is for you. As a specialist in Second Amendment jurisprudence, you are an expert on how the Bruin test has consigned us to weigh history with essentially every single discussion of gun regulation today. Can you tell us, how have guns and the Second Amendment shaped and interacted with American democracy throughout history, from the founding era and Reconstruction to the present day?
It's a fantastic question, Yvin. And first, before I answer, let me just say thank you to ACS for hosting us, and to you and to Makennan and your organizations for the incredible work that you've been doing. So the question you ask is in some ways like the biggest one. It's the through line that goes through all discussions about the Second Amendment, guns, and American society. There's no single answer. Of course, guns have been tools of liberation. They've been tools of oppression. They've been weapons of justifiable group and individual self-defense, as well as powerful implements with which to enforce hierarchy and exclusion. They've been tools to resist tyranny and tools to inflict it. The thing that stands out to me is that for most of American history, decisions about how guns can and should interact with democratic processes of government were made by democratic actors. That is, the people acting through their elected representatives could decide whether and how to restrict guns in order to preserve the public sphere. And that manifested in lots and lots of different ways. I'm happy to talk about in Q&A, restrictions on what kinds of weapons could be carried, who could carry them. For purposes of today, maybe the most visceral examples are what are called sensitive places restrictions. That is, prohibitions on taking guns into or near the places that are thought essential to the functioning of our democracy. So no guns in legislatures or in courthouses or polling places or schools. A lot of those laws were enacted against a backdrop of the threat or reality of politicized violence, going back to something Russ said in the introduction. Is not something that can ever be allowed to become normal. In the late 1700s, the major concerns were fights between patriots and loyalists. And so you had states like Delaware as far back as 1776 in its constitution saying, to prevent any violence or force used at said elections, no person shall come armed to any of them. New York, New Jersey, other states adopted similar laws. Fast forward 100 years, in the aftermath of Reconstruction, it's no longer patriots and loyalists fighting. This is now the area of white supremacists fighting to continue oppressing black citizens. And again, states adopt laws prohibiting, for example, this is a Louisiana law from 1870, prohibiting guns within half a mile of any place where a person might register to vote. And you see similar laws in Tennessee, Texas, Missouri, Maryland, really spreading across the country. Reva Siegel and I described some of these in a recent law review article. I could obviously go on. I think what's really significant about those laws is that they show people were using gun restrictions and gun regulations not only to preserve individual physical life, but to protect the public peace and the freedom of all people to participate in democracy free from terror and intimidation. And in that sense, regulating weapons wasn't seen as just like a limitation on the freedom of gun owners, but actually a necessary expression of collective self-governance and a prerequisite of a functioning democracy.
Absolutely. That is fantastic. And I loved your emphasis on how the depth of the terror that seeing a gun in a place that is integral to the functioning of American democracy, the degree of the terror that can spark in people. And I know that for young people growing up in today's mass shooting generation, we are simultaneously, but at the same time, increasingly terrified and scared to go into these places that should be places of public flourishing and civic life and society. So I think that it's fantastic that you're noting that it's been an issue that people have noted throughout history, and that the idea of gun regulations is not abnormal or confined to the 21st century. Makennan, I'll kick it to you.
Yeah, I really love that through line of how guns in public spaces does really invoke terror among the public. And that's something that I've been grateful that you and Reva Siegel Scholarship has really touched on. You know, in the same way we were once at a point where we only focused on the physical toll, the deaths and injury counts when it comes to gun violence, we moved the conversation and really pushed that needle to start talking about the mental health and the trauma that it inflicts on, especially the lockdown generation, young people, but really all people. And I think what needs to be done now is really pushing the needle to move that conversation to the social injuries that gun violence can inflict, and how it really does disrupt daily democratic life. I mean, it's an important tenet of democracy is civic life, of people not being scared to go out into their communities and participate and build community. And having guns in those spaces really does invoke that kind of terror that creates a barrier to just living in a democracy. We are living under a completely different institution, literally and definitionally speaking, if we don't have that luxury of being able to go outside without the fear of being shot. So that's a really good point and really important through line. I want to, McCord, do you have anything you want to add in here? I know you came off mute before I throw you another question.
Oh, no, we can go straight to the question. I would just say, I think too, whether you use the word terror or not, and it can be terrifying. I think that when what we're seeing here is two constitutional rights butting heads and a lack of recognition from the, I would just call them Second Amendment absolutists, that, you know, what they want to conceive of as their right, and we'll talk a little bit more about sort of, I think, some of the mythology around that right, is oftentimes used deliberately to infringe on other people's rights, whether it's your right to free speech at a rally or demonstration, whether it's your right to go to a polling place and vote without intimidation and harassment, whether it's your right to go to your county board meeting, your school board meeting, your state legislative meeting, and petition your government, which is your First Amendment right, without having to run the gauntlet of, you know, people bearing arms. So these things are infringing. They're not only terrifying people, they're infringing their exercise of constitutional rights.
Yeah, absolutely. I also want to highlight, you know, there's something to be said here when we're looking at this whole review of history and American history and how guns have interacted. While political violence might not look the same way that we once thought it would with guns, you know, it's not the same situation as the Civil War or the kind of guns that we saw at polling places in the Reconstruction era, as you were talking about, Professor Blocher. But that doesn't mean that political gun violence is obsolete or impossible. And we've been seeing the threat of that show up in a lot of different ways. And Russ even alluded to this earlier, you know, Giffords was born out of an act of political gun violence. And here I'm referring to the 2011 shooting in Tucson, where Congresswoman Gabby Giffords, who so courageously leads our organization today and continues this fight, was shot alongside 6 others who lost their lives that day and 12 more. And not only that, there's been so many other things we've seen in recent times with the election, you know, the 2 attempted assassinations on former President Trump. And now, as of Sunday, this is the 3rd time that a Harris campaign headquarters has been shot and attacked in Arizona. And luckily, no lives or injuries were lost there. But this is something that's coming up more and more. And we saw the attempted kidnaps of Governor Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan in 2020, when, like you said, extremists that didn't like her policies decided to take a whole nother level of action because they had access to guns like this and that kind of extremist rhetoric. And I really just want to underscore here, you know, when you add guns into this political situation, it really escalates. Obviously, we've seen throughout history that disagreements are inevitable. You know, we're going to have political arguments happen, but in the same way we say, if you enter a gun into a situation of just a common daily petty argument between 2 people, if you enter that also into a heated political argument, you're going to have catastrophic and deathly consequences. And that's why gun regulation is really so important for stopping that kind of gun violence that threatens our democracy in this political way. So I'm going to move that now to a question for you, Professor McCord. Your research, you know, focuses on issues of national security and paramilitary groups, areas that are not typically associated with guns and the Second Amendment in today's discussions and common public discourse. So I want to ask you, has this always been the case? You know, what's the relationship between these paramilitary groups and guns and the Second Amendment looked like throughout history and up into today?
So I want to focus, I mean, we have had private militias operating within the United States since before the founding, but they have never been authorized, right? And so I want to, you know, talk primarily today about the modern militia movement, sort of dating back to the early 90s. But whatever period of time you look at, you see that you know, private militias have really worked, I think, to create a mythology about the Second Amendment, and particularly the modern militias. If you speak to somebody who is part of the 3 Percenters or the now more or less defunct Oath Keepers or some local militia group, they will often say that they were contemplated by the founders as you know, being able to exist as a bulwark against a tyrannical central government, right? That we have to be able to have private actors gather together, train in arms, and be able to push back against a tyrannical central government. But that is actually ahistorical, it's atextual, and it is not consistent with Supreme Court precedent. If you go back even before the founding to the time of the colonies, it is true that the militia existed, but the militia was the same as it is now, defined as all able-bodied men, then it was just men, between certain ages that were available to be called forth by the governor in defense of the colony. And when so called forth, they reported up through the governor, right? They couldn't just decide when and under what circumstances they would undertake their own sort of private military action. In fact, the early militia acts, and Professor Blocher is more of a historian on this than I am, but in my research, the early militia acts, even predating the founding, made it clear well-regulated militia meant regulated by the state. And in fact, it was some of this notion of, some of the uses by private militias of their power and their force in rebellions against the authority of the state that really led to the founders embedding into the Second Amendment this notion of a well-regulated militia. Well-regulated, contrary to private militia actors, doesn't mean you get to self-regulate. So long as you have a commander and a deputy commander, you're well-regulated. That has always meant regulated by the government. And, I say that with a smile on my face, but literally that is what they will sometimes say. We are very well-regulated. We're disciplined. We have a hierarchy. We have training. We have rules, but it's not regulated by the state. And so these rebellions caused the founders to not only, embed well-regulated in the Second Amendment, but also to give Congress the authority under Article 1, which is where the legislative authority is located in our Constitution. Congress is the one that had the authority to provide for the organizing and disciplining of the militia. They executed that authority in early militia acts dating back to the 1700s that created what eventually over the decades and hundreds of years evolved into our National Guard system, right? So National Guard is now a dual system of enrollment where you enroll in your National Guard, you report up through the governor in every state. You can be called forth by the governor for certain things. It might be disaster relief. It can even, because it is a National Guard and not our U.S. military, it can even include sometimes law enforcement, those type of things. And then when there is a need, our federal government can also call up the National Guard. That is a lawful militia. The Congress also allowed for states, if they had a need for an additional militia to be available, they could have their own state defense forces, because sometimes the National Guard might be deployed elsewhere, right? And there's a need. But this always has meant regulated by the state. States then themselves in their constitutions, baked into their constitutions, that the military shall always be strictly subordinate to the civilian government, meaning reportable up through the government. No governor, no rogue militias. So this, and then the Supreme Court has also been clear since the late 1800s that military organization, military drill is uniquely the province of the government. There is no right to this that exists independent of the government. They did that in a case called Presser v. Illinois, 1886. It upheld a state anti-militia law that still exists on the books of nearly 30 states to this day. And said at the time, in upholding that law, not only does it not violate the First Amendment right of association, but it also, nothing about this prohibition on bodies of men from associating together as military units or military companies or parading or drilling in public with firearms, nothing about that prohibition violates the right to keep and bear arms under the Second Amendment, because private paramilitary organizations must be able to be prohibited in order to protect the public peace, safety, and good health. So I think one of the important things when we look back is that at the modern militia movement is they just deny all of that history, deny all of that Supreme Court precedent, instead, invoking sort of this mythology of militias as being this, true bulwark against a tyrannical central government. And that has, over the course of time, really resonated with a lot of people. I mean, I have talked even to law enforcement officers, and I'm not even talking about extremist law enforcement officers. That's a separate problem we'll get to later. But those who actually are trying to do right and to protect people from gun violence, who will say, well, what could we do? They have a Second Amendment right. And even law enforcement sometimes misunderstand they don't have a Second Amendment right to be their own private army.
Yeah, this is definitely, Blocher, I can see the light bulbs are going off in your head, and this is your forte, so feel free to jump in here.
No, I'm just gonna. I mean, all I can do is nod along. I mean, everything that Professor McCord is saying, of course, is exactly right, and I'm sure we can talk about this a little bit more later. But the release of the sort of anti-tyranny vision of the Second Amendment into these paramilitary organizations is independently itself terrifying and destructive, regardless of whether it has any uptake in the courts. Because once people have in their minds that they are the ones standing up for freedom and opposing tyranny, then you do get situations like, I mean, you mentioned earlier the attempted kidnapping of Governor Whitmer in Michigan. I mean, that same spring, a group of armed individuals invaded the Michigan legislature, opposing, Governor Whitmer's lockdown orders, claiming to be, opposing tyranny, and they shut down the legislature. I mean, it ended its term early. Nobody was killed, like, fortunately, nobody was physically hurt. Nobody also was arrested because it wasn't at the time illegal against, was not at the time against Michigan's law. But that's a real harm to what I would think of as the body politic, even if it's not a harm to an individual body. And it's all done under the banner of tyranny, but that just seems to liberate people to engage in this sort of like retail level rebellion, which is exactly against the way the rule of law operates.
Absolutely. That really reminds me this summer with the Kentucky highway shooter. For weeks then after that, public schools in Kentucky were shut down. And like you're saying, when they invaded the legislature and it shut down, yes, that obviously disrupts our democratic processes. But just like we were saying, the democratic daily life, the civic life that we're engaged in this country, that also gets shut down when instances of gun violence happen like this, when extremists get empowered and think that this is something that they can do. And, we're going to ask you about the insurrectionist theory of the Second Amendment in a little, so I won't get too deep into it. But yeah, this is exactly on par with what we wanted to talk about with guns and democracy and what the gravest threat really is. And these paramilitaries should be part of the conversation and too often get left out of this discourse. I'll pass it back to you, Yvin, for our next question.
Absolutely. So picking back up on the thread of modern day paramilitary groups, heavily armed groups have, as you guys noted, increasingly asserted themselves in public spaces, oftentimes under the banner of resisting tyranny or exercising their Second Amendment rights. Professor McCord, not only have you extensively studied some of these groups, but you've also actually been directly involved in prosecuting them, giving you unique insights into how they operate and how they threaten democratic society. Can you share with us what tends to go unseen beyond the headlines and give us a sense of what it looks like to deal with these groups on the ground? I believe you're muted.
Sorry, goodness, I should know better than that. Just to be clear, when we use the term prosecuted, even though I spent a good amount of my career, more than 20 years as a federal prosecutor, the kind of prosecuting of these groups that I have done since I left the government is in the form of bringing civil litigation against them, successful litigation, including against 23 different white nationalist and explicit paramilitary groups who participated in the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville. And we did that using state anti-militia laws, the state constitutional provision saying that the military shall in all cases be strictly subordinate to the federal government, laws against paramilitary activity, and laws against falsely assuming the functions of law enforcement. Because what we will sometimes see with these militia groups, we've been talking a lot about their sort of offensive activity, assaulting the State House in Lansing, Michigan, and disrupting government operations. Obviously, January 6th was an assault on the government, but they also very frequently will falsely assume the functions of law enforcement. In Charlottesville, you had both white nationalist groups who were engaging deliberately in, wanted to have open air battles with their ideological opponents, but you also had fully kitted out self-proclaimed militias protecting them, and they have no authority to protect anybody. They're not law enforcement, they're not licensed security service, they're not the National Guard, yet because they've got military kits on and they've got AR-15s and multiple sidearms, et cetera, they portray authority over others just because of their appearance, right? And so we use those laws as well, and we were successful in obtaining court-ordered injunctions against all of the defendants, prohibiting them forevermore from organizing as in groups of 2 or more, acting in concert while armed with anything that could be used as a weapon, so not just a firearm, but other things too, because in Charlottesville, many other things were used, during any protest, rally, demonstration, or march. And we've done these similar prosecutions elsewhere, successfully including in New Mexico, in that case, actually partnering with the elected district attorney, so using his civil enforcement authority. But to your question about what are these groups really like? Particularly since January 6th and the involvement of some, well-known paramilitary groups in that assault, we've seen a real effort, and this is not brand new post January 6th, but a real effort at rebranding, right? So oftentimes, if you look at the publicly available materials, even if you take the Oath Keepers, whose leader is now serving a 2-decade sentence, and others have been convicted of seditious conspiracy and are serving lengthy sentences. Before that, the Oath Keepers would often bill themselves not as a militia. In fact, they would eschew that title. They would talk about they're there to provide sort of community preparedness training, right? Be ready to respond in the event of natural disasters, right? And go help with hurricane relief and forest fire relief and other types of relief. They would tout that they go and they do food drives and things like this. And they try to create this facade for themselves that they are really just about helping their neighbors. They will also often have on sort of their publicly available materials that might include websites that they are, they have explicit policies against racism, that they're not white supremacists, et cetera, et cetera. And they use all of this to, create sort of a public acceptance of them. They'll say that they're there to uphold the Constitution. What they don't say is that's the Constitution as we understand it, which may or may not be consistent with what the Constitution says or what the Supreme Court has told us how we have to interpret it. It's our view of the Constitution. And they will also use that for fundraising. Many of them actually are able to and have obtained nonprofit status. So they will openly fundraise for their activities. So that's their public facade. Then you start to scratch below the surface and you start to look at what are their Facebook postings maybe in their personal capacities, what are their other social media postings, what are they saying in chat rooms, many of which have sometimes been made public through the work of independent private researchers who dig into these things and look to see. And I'm not to a person, not to a group, but like very, very often you see explicit white supremacist, anti-immigrant, anti-government, anti-other sentiment in their personal and even in their official sort of social media postings and in statements they make at rallies or at other events where they're out speaking. And these may be things as violent as suggesting that migrants should be shot on the border, and suggesting things like civil war, right? So there's a real disconnect, I think, between the public image that they often try to portray, again, going back to this, we're a bulwark against the tyranny, we're here to protect your constitutional rights, and the actual ideology that is motivating them. The other point, and the last point I'll make, and just let me illustrate that, when they were in Charlottesville protecting the white supremacists, the private chats and planning materials that eventually became public revealed very clearly what the intent here was, right? Provoke counter protesters to throw that first water bottle by being provocative, right? Doing the Nazi salute, saying things like, blood and soil, etc. And then once that counter protester does something the slightest bit violent, and I'm not condoning it, then come back in full force, much more violently, and invoke self-defense. So it was a provoke and invoke strategy, and they would even discuss about, in advance of the rally, cracking some commie skulls. So this is it's important for people to realize that public appearance is oftentimes just a facade for what's really going on there. And I would also say some of them are just grifters. Stuart Rhodes, the former head of the Oath Keepers, who's now in prison, he didn't really care about the things that he was trying to lead his group to do. He would raise money. He would go out to where his people were camped out and saying, I'm going to be with one of you. And then he'd go back to his hotel and have a steak dinner with the money that people contributed to his organization.
Wow. There's lots to say to that. I think what's interesting is the provocation strategy that you were describing really harkens back to exactly what I was saying earlier. The danger of just having a gun in a situation, it will automatically escalate it. And it's just absolutely crazy to imagine that this is something that people are doing in public and really terrifying. and really shows how much this can chill free speech in a very tangible and detrimental way when it comes to these kinds of protests. And also, it's really interesting, I would say equal parts interesting and terrifying to hear the kind of legitimizing strategies that they're using in the public. And that's not something that I was ever privy to. And I'm sure shocks a lot of people, that they're offering relief and support and trying to build trust in communities and espousing that they're not actually white supremacists, when in reality, that is the views they hold. I think that's really important information and knowledge to have to help us arm ourselves when we're talking about trying to combat these kinds of things and making sure that they don't proliferate across the country. And as far as their view of the Second Amendment, now we'll turn to Professor Blocher on that. As many of us know, the ruling in DC v. Heller, alongside it stating, the individual right interpretation of the Second Amendment as law of the land, it did raise concerns among some Americans that allowing American citizens to have firearms in their homes for the purpose of self-defense would then, open the floodgates to having more guns in public spaces and thus threatening our public safety and the democratic health of our society. And, those concerns proved valid as the historical test that was set forth in Bruin years later disrupted that tradition of giving proper weight to the government's role in ensuring public safety, and especially the public's perception of safety, which is a core tenet of our actual safety in public when we're deciding Second Amendment challenges. So I want to ask you, how have the court's rulings in Bruin and more recently in US v. Rahimi implicated and perhaps endangered, our democratic society and the concept of rights balancing that we've been getting at in this conversation? And what are the real world implications for everyday Americans when it comes to these kinds of court decisions?
Yeah, I mean, it's another wonderful and another huge question, Makennan. So, my immediate reaction is that what has changed most in the sort of era that we are in now, the sort of Heller and Bruin era, is that decisions about how guns can and should interact with democratic processes are increasingly being answered not by democratic actors, but by courts. And part of that is just the inevitable implication of the court's decision in Heller, which was that the Second Amendment is not limited to the organized militia, but extends to private purposes like self-defense. Like once the court decides that, it inevitably is going to take certain kinds of policy options off the table, because that's what constitutional rights do. That's the purpose of a constitutional right is in some sense to be counter-majoritarian and to maybe prohibit things that we might otherwise prefer to do, whether it's regulate hate speech or whatever else protected by the First Amendment. The Second Amendment is going to protect some kinds of arms and arm-related activities that people might otherwise want to regulate. I think for the most part, most people can live with that because some of the kinds of gun restrictions that were, for example, called into question in Heller, frankly, weren't popular to begin with. DC and Chicago were the only two cities in the country that had municipal handgun bans at the time. In that sense, Heller didn't change the law that much, at least immediately. Bruin is a whole other story. For my money, what I find distressing about Bruin is not that it protects a constitutional right against regulation. I can even make my peace with Heller, although I was one of the attorneys on the losing side in that case. It's that Bruin is just bad law. It's just bad constitutional doctrine. This project of figuring out how to accommodate fundamental constitutional rights and important public regulatory interests is nothing new for constitutional law. And those on the call who are lawyers will be familiar with the ways that constitutional doctrine does this, right? Whether it's through the tiers of scrutiny or time, place, manner restrictions or adequate alternatives analysis. I mean, there's generations of tools that judges have developed to figure out when and how we can regulate certain kinds of constitutional rights. And Bruin just seems to throw all of that out the window and says instead, and you suggested this in your question, Makennan, that all modern gun laws have to be evaluated solely based on whether they are consistent with text, history, and tradition. And I mean, I think it's just a remarkable act of, frankly, hubris by the court. The court, in that one opinion, struck down or at least called into question probably more than 2,000 decisions issued by state and federal courts in the 15 years after Heller. The courts had developed this two-part framework I'm happy to talk about. The Supreme Court junks that, replaces it with this new text, history, and tradition test, which has proven, I think, unsurprisingly, utterly unworkable. And I think that this is not just a critique of people in the gun violence prevention community, but even among gun rights scholars and people who like Heller. I think note that it's just impossible to imagine getting meaningful guidance from history about specific questions like whether it's okay today to prohibit guns in subways, right? James Madison never had a coherent thought about guns on airplanes, like, which is prohibited under federal law, load a gun in an airplane cabin. There's nothing in 1791 that's going to give you any meaningful guidance about that. I mean, if you look at the laws that existed in 1791, they had a lot of gun restrictions, misunderstood. They had a lot of gun laws, but they just don't track the kinds of things that we're doing today. They prohibited gun possession by Black Americans, Native Americans, Catholics, Loyalists. What kind of guidance do we get from that about whether today we want to disarm domestic abusers, which they largely didn't do, right? You mentioned earlier, even, being the experiences of the lockdown generation, right? The literally hundreds of thousands of people today who've been present in a school where a shooting happened, right? Mass shootings were not a problem in 1791 simply because the technology didn't work in the same way. I mean, I don't know how many people on this call have ever fired a black powder musket. I have done. It's hard to do. I had somebody to help me, and in 2 minutes, we got off 3 shots, 2 of which misfired. I've also fired an AR-15. Radically different experience. Does not require a lot of training, right? The problems are just different. And so the thought that history is going to guide judges, I think is just nonsense. Now, what happens with Bruin very quickly is that it breaks down into a test of analogies. And so judges are just trying to decide, well, is this prohibited group today, say domestic abusers, similar enough or relevantly similar to the groups that were prohibited in 1791? And that opens the doors to just all kinds of judicial discretion and unpredictable outcomes. And that's why the case outcomes are all over the place. Now, you did mention Rahimi, so I should end on a positive note here. Rahimi is at least some corrective to the Bruin test. This is the case handed down last summer, wherein the court, in an 8-1 opinion, upheld the federal law 18 U.S.C. 922 G8, a provision of it anyway, which prohibits gun possession by people who are subject to certain kinds of qualifying domestic violence restraining orders. That's not a law that existed in exactly that form in 1791, but the majority opinion, written by Chief Justice Roberts, rightly recognizes you have to look to principles in history. It's not just a matter of counting up laws, which is basically what Justice Thomas does in his dissent in Rahimi. He's the one. But the other 8 justices understand, like, history is not just a set of inert facts. It actually has principles and purposes, and we have to sort of divine those. And so, Rahimi, easy case, in my view, should have been 9-0 in favor of the government, but at least it gives some kind of directive to Bruin. I think, legislatures should not give up. Most gun laws are still being upheld. We're just in a period of great uncertainty and for the Second Amendment.
Absolutely. I think what's so interesting is on this theme of guns and democracy is not only is the Bruin test unworkable, but it really, like you were alluding to, it eradicated the 2-part test that we had before that did consider the government's legitimate interest of promoting public safety among its citizens. And so that decision, among the many other things it did, it flew in the face of the will of the people and democracy, and really that safety, that right to safety that we should have every single time that we walk out of our houses. So I really resonate with you there. And I think that's an important part of what we're talking about. And I would like to believe too, that we're on a little better footing post Rahimi, but yeah, it's still unfortunate circumstances for taking public safety into account here. I'll pass it to you, Yvin.
Absolutely. Something that really strikes me is just, Professor McCord, you pointed out how the ways in which paramilitary groups frame themselves, those are ahistorical and atextual and also just inconsistent with facts and lived reality. And Professor Blocher, as you alluded to, the framework for Second Amendment cases is inconsistent with most constitutional jurisprudence. It's inconsistent with the realities of American history, and usually it just does not comport with common sense and logic. But what strikes me is that these ideas still retain such salience in the public imagination. Upon closer scrutiny, they fall apart and they don't make sense. But these groups and these individuals have a knack for using just the right words to seem compellingly historical, and they capture the societal imagination in a way that makes it really, really hard for us to rebut those ideas. So, Professor McCord, I want to give you a chance to jump in on that question as well. If not, I'll toss you another one.
Yeah, I think that, I agree with everything that Professor Blocher said about sort of how our jurisprudence has evolved. But the point that you just made, Yvin, I think is so critical for people to understand. Other constitutional rights, First Amendment rights even, which are really protected in this country, sometimes, frankly, protected more than I think they should be, but are really protected. Even they challenges to those don't get the kind of test that the Second Amendment challenges get. It is still every level of scrutiny, even at the highest level strict, is still a type of a balancing test where you are weighing the government's compelling interest in regulation against the infringement on the constitutional right. So when people like Justice Thomas, who had said for years that, the court's jurisprudence, various courts' jurisprudence was relegating the Second Amendment to sort of a second-class right, what he did in Bruin wasn't just match it up to other rights like the First Amendment. He put it higher than them. And that is what I think is really, such a travesty here, that suddenly that right would be elevated. But that's what you're doing when you're saying, no, this isn't about looking at the government's interests. This is looking to see in 1791 or maybe 1868, not sure, but in 1791, was there a closely analogous regulation? Again, eased a little bit by Rahimi, which is like, is it consistent with the principles that underline our regulatory tradition? And that's really kind of why the government prevailed in Rahimi, because certainly there was not a bar on domestic abusers having firearms. Basically, domestic abuse was just a family issue that the courts ignored unless you killed your partner. But they looked to the history of laws that prevented individuals who threatened harm to others. They looked to that history and the principles behind that history to uphold that gun law.
Absolutely. I think in many ways, Rahimi was a victory of common sense. It was very fortunate to see that at least some of the justices had the wherewithal to say, oh, actually, I don't want domestic abusers to hold firearms. And I think it's that maybe a little bit instinctual or just rational understanding that taking the most extreme iteration of the Bruin test to its logical end, it produces really bad outcomes that just do not make sense with where we are in the 21st century. I want to pivot a little bit away from the Second Amendment and back to paramilitary groups. So Professor McCord, alongside the civil suits you've brought, you also served as counsel to the January 6th Task Force Capitol Security Review, and you provided expert testimony to the January 6th committee in the House of Representatives. Despite the shocking reality of rioters breaching the US Capitol in an attempt to thwart the democratic process and peaceful transition of power, extreme polarization meant that not everybody recognized or perhaps believed the full gravity of the situation. What was the greatest challenge you faced in those roles, and what did you learn from those experiences about maybe the fragility of democracy when faced with armed violence?
And I don't know if this is so specific to those roles, because I was, serving in a legal capacity with respect to the review of the physical security of the Capitol and of its members. But certainly when I did the expert statement for the House Select Committee at their request, it was to try to explain some of what we've been talking about today, about the rise of paramilitarism openly engaging with members of the public and how that has been very dangerous to our democracy, particularly in the last 10 years, and continues to be so going forward. And I previewed some of the current threats. And the reason I say that is, until recently, really the 20 teens, most of the private militia activity in modern history involved standoffs against the federal government, right? So, and it was oftentimes out west, and it was oftentimes about the use of federal lands. So even in 2014, we had militias from all over the country come to Bunkerville, Nevada, to aid Cliven Bundy, who was having a standoff against the Bureau of Land Management because he had been grazing his cattle for decades on federal lands without paying the taxes that he is required to pay to do that. It's just federal law. You've got to pay taxes if you are grazing if you have permission to graze and you graze your cattle on federal lands. He had never paid them. The Bureau of Land Management was coming to move these cattle, and he just said, no. I mean, talk about insurrectionist theory. We're not going to have it. He called on militias from around the country to come. They came heavily armed. They got once the federal officers were down in a ravine, the militias surrounded them, including militias up on a highway overpass with sniper rifles trained on the heads of federal agents. and the federal agents backed down, right? So this was a dispute that was a success for the militias, but it was a dispute that if you weren't part of it, if you're a regular American anywhere else in the world, it has no impact on you, right? We saw a similar thing at Malheur Wildlife Refuge, where a militia took over the wildlife refuge and, you know, had a standoff with the federal government. What's really changed in the last, since like 2016, is now militias are out there engaging with the public all the time. And we've talked about several examples, assaults on state houses. We also talked about them showing up at the Unite the Right rally to, you know, ostensibly to protect the rights of the white supremacists, but actually, you know, infringing on the rights of others. We've seen ballot drop box monitoring in the 2022 midterms. We know that some are planning that now. We've seen, you know, militias showing up at county board meetings, school board meetings, state legislative hearings. We've seen county, I'm sorry, not county, we've seen militia members running for office. Now, one could say, well, isn't that, if they run for office and they're elected, isn't that democracy at work? Well, it depends on how they're running. Are they running in ways that they're threatening, intimidating opponents from running? In Shasta County, California, they pushed out Republican county board members who were not extreme enough in favor of more extreme board members whose ideology aligned with theirs. Is that really democracy at work, or is that intimidation and threats that causes other people to not actually go vote or not even run because they're running against extremism? So I think, you know, one of the things I was trying to convey is the damage, the very topic of today's discussion, the damage to our democracy from these groups now out engaging in some parts of the country on a daily basis with other members of the public. And when you come heavily armed, when you've got an AR-15 and multiple high-capacity magazines, and you're in a military kit with flak jackets and helmets and Kevlar and boots, what signal, you know, what message are you sending to the unarmed, you know, person in a t-shirt and jeans who's trying to exercise their constitutional rights? It's one message: I can kill you if I want to kill you, right? And there's nothing you can do about it. And so, you know, just to make people sort of understand this threat to the rest of the population was one of the main things that I was trying to convey. And the other main point, and this is still today, I speak about this constantly, is false narratives provide the justification in the minds of paramilitary actors and others to engage in political violence, whether political violence is an actual physical violence or just this intimidation and threats and pervasive terror that we've been talking about today. And that is what we've also seen just an enormous increase in these last 10 years is false narratives. There's always been liars out there, but false narratives that are now propagated by and propounded by and spread by people in positions of power with a veneer of credibility, elected officials. You know, one of our major political party candidates right now engaging in outright lies. Just take the most recent, that Haitian immigrants are eating people's pets in Springfield, Ohio. That is just a lie. It's been debunked by every level of law enforcement and government in Ohio, including the Republican governor. Yet what has it done? It provided the justification for people to do things like bomb threats and, you know, other threats of physical violence. It's now spread to a bigger, broader anti-immigrant message across the country. We have disinformation right now by people about FEMA's hurricane relief, disinformation about what the government is doing, saying they instead of providing hurricane relief to the survivors in North Carolina, and soon we're going to be talking very much about Tampa Bay and other parts of Florida. No, instead, what the false narratives are is that they're sending that money, spending all that money on migrants and immigration, or sending it abroad to others. So these are the things that then create, you know, the justification for those who are so inclined to go out and take action. And so if we can't get at that false narrative, that is where, you know, that's what it all comes back to. And that's what, you know, in addition to guns, because, you know, people say guns don't kill people, people kill people. Well, people with guns kill people is the way I would look at it. But, you know, we've also got to direct ourselves as don't give these folks this justification. That's what Stop the Steal was. That was what January 6th was. It was a false narrative about the election that people used to justify their attack on the U.S. Capitol.
It's just so crazy that we have these conversations about declining candidate quality, and to hear that there's paramilitary members actually running for office is very sobering. And I think a really important thing to think about when we're talking about, we need to expose the underbelly of what this looks like, this extremism and this threat to democracy when it comes to guns. And I really think you're hitting the nail on its head there when it comes to this deadly combination of lies and guns. And this isn't something new that we've seen in the gun space. You know, I think there's a lot of parts of our fight in the gun violence prevention movement that need to be brought to protecting democracy, and some that in areas that aren't immediately apparent. And one of those comes to, you know, overturning, repealing PLCAA. The PLCAA, I'm talking about the Protection of Lawful Commerce and Arms Act, passed in Congress in 2005, essentially shields the gun manufacturers from any kind of civil liability for their role in, you know, propagating this gun violence epidemic. But that's all to say that, you know, these gun manufacturers have engaged in this kind of marketing, and capitalizing on these kinds of lies for their bottom line, for their bottom dollar. And that comes to stoking white supremacy, extremist views, this kind of us versus them rhetoric that has really allowed them to make the public feel like they need to be armed to the teeth to try to combat these things, and that there's this looming threat. And they need to promulgate guns to do this. And I think it's a really, really sad reality that we're living in, and somewhere where we need to kind of bring the fight when it comes to guns and democracy. So I think that conversation is really pertinent, and something that I know Giffords and March for Our Lives have been working on. And I want to turn to, you know, maybe a more positive note about the kinds of things that we can do when it comes to protecting ourselves from this really dangerous and parasitic relationship of guns and democracy. We recently at Giffords have helped pass in California, alongside the Brennan Center for Justice, the Peace Act. This is a bill that explicitly prohibits intimidation of voters and election officials at every part of the voting process. You're not allowed to have a gun in voting places and polling places. That is a protected, sensitive space, but it also provides civil remedies for people, for ballot officials, for individual voters, to hold people liable if they are found to intimidate them with guns at the polls. But that's not all that we can do. You know, Professor Blocher, you talked about, it's really important to protect these government sites where legislative decision-making is happening from guns. We need to protect those as sensitive spaces and keep up that tradition, and, you know, really bolster those kinds of laws. The same goes with polling places, and the same goes for protest places. We've seen this under attack in a lot of litigation recently. Sensitive places laws that protect places of protest from having guns in them have been falling from time to time across this country in different lower courts. And that is a really sad and shameful thing, I think, to see, because like we've been saying, you know, there is a legitimate chilling effect that happens on First Amendment rights, on free speech in these protest places when you see a gun. And to be quite frank, these kinds of paramilitaries and extremists are showing up not to places where people agree with them with guns, but to places where they disagree with the people and what they're protesting and saying. And that is because they have the intention of stifling that speech, you know, and of making them feel uncomfortable in their own democratic society and going home, and they shouldn't be expressing these kinds of views. So this is really important stuff, and, you know, all things that our organizations are working towards, but really something to think about. Where are the different arenas, the different kinds of intersections where we can bring our fight in the gun violence prevention space to protecting democracy? And I want to turn it now, you know, we're talking about what's at stake in the 2024 election. And, you know, the big ringer, the infamous Project 2025 comes to mind for a lot of people. And I really want to give space for us to talk about this and the kind of implications it has for gun regulations across the country, and really what we can do about it. So I'm going to turn it to you, Yvin, to start us off there.
Yes, I'm going to run through these at a little bit of a faster clip. If you want to hear more expansion on any of them, please feel free to send in a question. But some of the proposals listed in Project 2025 is to the funding of red flag laws, which allow law enforcement to temporarily remove firearms from people who pose an imminent risk of harm to themselves or others. It would strip the ATF and the Department of Justice of most of its regulatory authority, and it would either put individuals in place in state and local offices who would refuse to enforce existing gun laws, or it would use the threat of lawsuits, removal from office, and potentially even criminal prosecution to ensure compliance with the federal laws that do get on the books. Makennan, I'll toss it back to you.
Because unfortunately, it doesn't stop there. Project 2025 would also destroy firearm records that are used by law enforcement for them to be able to solve gun crimes and stop bad actors from committing these crimes. And it would entirely defund crime victims' funds and legislative and administrative efforts that we've had to provide support for survivors of gun violence. And that's really crucial part of breaking these cycles of violence, especially in the communities that need it most. And this would also include entirely defunding CVI, community violence intervention programs, which have proven to be one of the most effective tools of curbing everyday gun violence in so many communities. And I really want to I think the biggest thing to underscore here, and probably the biggest threat that Project 2025 poses, is the Concealed Carry Reciprocity Act. This is something that is absolutely wild and a really scary thing to think that it could become reality at one point. And it's perhaps our biggest worry. This is something the gun lobby's been after for quite some time now, and it's probably one of their most egregious asks. So this would essentially force every state to recognize the concealed carry standards for every other state. And that includes even those that have dramatically weaker gun laws or don't require permits at all for people to get public carry licenses. So if you think about it in reality, someone in Texas who can carry a hidden loaded handgun on their person in their state without having to get a permit and a background check for that matter, can go to a state like California or New York or New Jersey, where it's illegal to do these things, and be able to carry their hidden loaded gun in public. And I think what's really interesting about this when we talk about the theme of guns and democracy is that this really does fly in the face of the will of the people. In a state like California, New Jersey, New York, any state that saw it fit to enact these gun laws to protect themselves and their communities, CCR concealed carry reciprocity would essentially say to them, no, you don't get to decide what is best for you and your families and your communities to ensure their public safety. Instead, you're subject to the will of even the most fringe gun regimes in the country. And I really see this as the epitome of thwarting democracy. And like we've been saying, ascending that Second Amendment right of one individual above all other rights for all other people, including their rights, to govern themselves. And we know that weakening requirements for carrying a firearm is obviously associated with increases in gun violence and violent crimes, mass shootings, the whole nine. So this would all but ensure that every person in every state in this country not only gets to feel safe, but not physically would be safe. And so I think all of this taken together, it really shows you that Project 2025 is a wholesale gutting of public safety and really our democratic health in that way, as far as states' rights and balanced government and the ability of, every citizen to live freely and safely in our society goes. And with that, I want to turn it to you, Professor Blocher, in this vein of rights balancing and the future of the Second Amendment, as far as the Supreme Court is concerned. I want to ask you, and this can all be speculative and perhaps based on your own intuition, how do you think that this Supreme Court would handle future questions of competing constitutional rights when it comes to the Second Amendment's chilling effect on other constitutional freedoms, as we've talked about? And what we were kind of getting at earlier with the insurrectionist theory that, paramilitaries have been promulgating, to what extent should we be concerned about the insurrectionist theory of the Second Amendment taking hold in the Supreme Court or something like it?
So I hear two questions there, one on the competing rights and one on the insurrection theory, and I know we're short on time, so I'll be quick on both. On the question of conflicting rights claims, I think this is one of the most important framing issues in the entire gun debate, inside and outside courts. Professor McCord mentioned this earlier, and your question does, and even actually some of your comments as well. I think there has been a tendency historically in the gun debate to see like a constitutional right on one side and sort of like nebulous policy interests on the other side, and we know what happens when these two things come into contact, which is that the constitutional right tends to trump. And again, that's how a lot of constitutional rights work. You can't, going back to Professor McCord's example, you can't typically defeat a free speech claim only by saying, hey, we've got some important regulatory interests. There has to be a little bit more. The thumb is on the scale for the right. And I think what that misses is exactly what you've been hearing today, which is that it's rights on all sides when we're talking about especially guns in public places, right? This is a matter of one person's now recognized Second Amendment right to carry a gun into public places, coming into contact with other people's equally fundamental constitutional rights to speak, peaceably assemble, vote, exercise religion freely. Like all of those are impacted in one way or another. And again, to elevate a theme that you've heard from all of us, is that sometimes the harms to other rights holders don't show up in the same way that we are traditionally used to seeing gun harms, right? A person who is, decides not to attend a political rally or not to vote, or who is truant from school because they're scared or because they've experienced gun violence, they don't show up in the casualty list, right? They don't show up in an ER, but it is so important to understand that trauma and whatever that experience is something that matters in the constitutional calculus. So I certainly hope that the public discussion and the courts will be able to understand understand both of those things together. On the insurrectionary theory, I think the greatest threat is the one that Professor McCord was describing earlier, about the sort of rhetorical force of it and the way that it sort of facilitates and enables, especially when combined with the sort of disinformation and misinformation that we're seeing, the kinds of violent conduct that we see. I maybe famous last words here. I'm relatively sanguine about the justices not adopting at least a hardcore version of the insurrectionist theory. I think, you know, any purported textualists, as they claim to be, has to grapple with the fact that the Constitution repeatedly and specifically rules out the idea of insurrection being constitutionally protected. And just to rat off a few, Article 1, Section 3, Clause 1 defines treason as a constitutional crime. Of course, we're all familiar with last year, the 14th Amendment's Section 3 prohibits certain people from holding office who've engaged in insurrection or rebellion. Article 4, Clause 4, the Republican Government Clause requires Congress to protect people against domestic violence, meaning internal violence. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 15. I mean, you can go on. The text of the Constitution makes it clear the insurrectionist theory has no place in constitutional doctrine. If there's a right to revolution, you're not going to find it in the text of the Constitution.
Fantastic. Thank you both so much. Thank you so much, Makennan, as well, for your incredible inputs and like co-moderation. It has been such a pleasure learning from your expertise. And I hope that even though some of these things are very sobering and quite frankly, a little bit terrifying to hear, they also are incentivizing and give us energy to do our part in preserving American democracy. I think we've talked a lot about what the relationship between guns and democracy was, what it is, and potentially what it threatens to be. But let's talk a little bit more about what it should be and what we can do to make that happen. So I will pass it to Ashley from the ACS to talk about that.
Thanks, Yvin. I just want to quickly mention a few ways that folks can get involved. I think all of us listening today realize how high the stakes are for democracy, especially this election season. And so I'm just going to mention a few nonpartisan ways that you can get involved right now. First is to encourage everyone to volunteer as a poll worker. This election season, poll workers are still needed all across the country, especially in some key states that includes California, Florida, Georgia, Massachusetts, Michigan, Missouri, New York, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Texas, and Virginia. Poll workers power our democracy. They're needed to keep polling places open, to make sure everyone has the right to vote. ACS has a poll worker pledge that you can sign right now. When you do, we'll connect you with our partner, Power the Polls, who will then help you find out what the needs are in your local community and help you sign up to volunteer. Second, you can join local election protection efforts, the National Nonpartisan Coalition. Make sure that all voters have an equal opportunity to vote and have that vote counted. There are needs now during early voting, on election day. And I also want to emphasize that there will be volunteer needs after election day as well. So consider volunteering there. We will throw a link into the chat as well. And then third, if you're an attorney, there's a great organization called the Election Official Legal Defense Network that is providing pro bono help to election officials who are increasingly facing waves of state laws subjecting them to criminal penalties for doing their professional duties. So if you're interested in that, there will also be a link for you to sign up there. And then lastly, I just most importantly want to emphasize that you should vote. Make a plan to vote, tell your friends, tell your family, generally get involved this election season and beyond. We here at ACS are always here to help you find ways to plug in, and you can always find out more information about your local chapter as well. If you have any questions, let us know, and I'm going to turn it back over to Makennan. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ashley. Yes, yes, yes to everything you said, especially the voting. Please vote. But yeah, and it's really great to hear. I think if there's one takeaway from this conversation, it's that we all have an active role to play in democracy, and that these are really privileges that we have to be involved. And so we should take full advantage of that and really do all we can to protect the kind of systems we have in place. So now we're going to turn to the Q&A, and we have some really good questions that have come in. So I'm going to pick and choose because we are running short on time. But the first question, we do have a question on Vanderstock. So for those of you who don't know, Garland v. Vanderstock is a case currently before the Supreme Court. Oral arguments were just this past Tuesday, in which the court is hearing a challenge to ATF's ghost gun rule. prohibiting ghost guns. These are firearms that are typically assembled from a weapons parts kit and can be easily and readily made into a functioning firearm, which is very concerning, and allows an individual to obtain a gun without a background check and a serial number on the weapon, which makes it very difficult to trace. So with that, the question is, professors, what are your thoughts on Vanderstock, and what do you think will happen with ghost guns more generally in this case and after the election?
I'm happy to take a
Anyone
quick
take-
stab at this. I mean, just a couple things to emphasize on Vanderstock. This is not a Second Amendment case. It's not a question of whether ghost guns are protected by the Constitution. It's just a question of whether they can be regulated under the statutes and regulations as they are currently written. The case was just argued this week, and I think most observers feel like the argument went reasonably well for the government. I don't want to jinx anything in terms of the outcome. The importance of this regulation, I think, cannot be understated. The reason why ghost guns are so troubling is because they can be purchased without the normal regulations that apply when one buys a gun from a licensed dealer, primarily including things like background checks and a serial number, both of which are really important for keeping guns out of the wrong hands and for tracing crime guns on the back end. But what we've seen, and what Vanderstock is a good example of, as with Cargill last year, which was the bump stocks case, the technology of violence continues to evolve, and the industry, going back to something that you mentioned earlier, Makennan, continues to come up with new products to get around whatever the rules are, responding to legal regulations. Should also note, for anybody who doesn't know, the court just agreed to hear a huge PLACA case involving Mexico's industry suit against the gun industry for exactly the kinds of harms you described. Not a Second Amendment case, but enormously significant for the future of gun rights and regulation.
I would just add to that. I also think that the argument was very positive in terms of looking good for the government upholding this ATF regulation. One of the things that was almost not discussed at all in the argument, although the Solicitor General did bring it up in her rebuttal, is what is the practical reality. And I was privileged to file an amicus brief in the case, as probably many of you did as well. Mine was on behalf of the Major City Police Chiefs Organization, Police Executive Research Forum, and then a whole litany of dozens of former high-level national security officials and prosecutors and law enforcement at both Republicans and Democrats, all talking about the danger of ghost guns. And just to put a little bit of granularity on it, Major City Chiefs data showed that between January 2019 and May 2021, 408% increase in criminal incidents involving ghost guns. That included 285% increase in the use of ghost guns by those under the age of 18, who obviously wouldn't have been able to get these guns if they had to go through a background check. 255% increase in the use of ghost guns in criminal incidents by those with prior convictions of a gun crime. Obviously, they wouldn't have been able to get a gun if they'd gone through a background check. Manufacturers specifically tout them because you don't have to go through a background check. They will say, anonymity is our priority here and make it as easy as possible. Foreign terrorist organizations try to get their hands on these because they are so readily available and they are not traceable. And the same with drug cartels. So it's not just individual crimes, but organized criminals and terrorists are very much in the market for these. And last point, in addition to not being able to trace where there's no serial number, trace a gun used in a crime to hopefully find who committed that crime, it also hampers our ability to monitor and figure out massive gun trafficking on an international scale. Because when you have serialization, you can determine, are guns manufactured in some state in the US? Where are those guns ending up? That might be in the US, that might be in other countries, it might be in places like Mexico, who is suing the US gun manufacturers for so many weapons coming into their country, alleging that they know that these are going into the hands of drug cartels and others. So really, really huge implications of this case. And people across the political spectrum have weighed in.
Absolutely. And your comments remind me of something you said earlier, which is when somebody shows up to a polling place with an AR-15 and clad in riot gear, they're sending one clear message to the other unarmed people who are at the polling place as well. I think it ties into this idea of there's one reason why ghost guns are sold and marketed and used. And even if industry marketers try to frame it as, well, there's a lot of different uses and who knows really what these consumers are going to use them for, it's pretty clear to anybody who looks at it for longer than a second that there's one clear reason that these firearm kits are being manufactured and sold. So we had another question in the Q&A, and it starts with, deliberate deceit has been used for decades in attempting to change the interpretation of the Second Amendment. The New York Times had a story not long ago about a supposed disinterested academic who took money to write papers supporting the Heller interpretation. And this person's comments reminded me of the through line that the narratives promulgated by paramilitary groups and Second Amendment extremists aren't always true. So, professors, how do we push back against such narratives? And as part of that, I'd love to hear about the scholarship and the ideas that you guys are developing in your respective fields and how we can share that with a greater audience.
So I think that the reference in that question is to a New York Times story about a professor named William English, which I happen to know about because I'm quoted in that article, which then sparked a response from Professor English in the Wall Street Journal calling me an anti-gun zealot. So you can read both sides of the debate about his scholarship. I mean, the way to push back from my position as a scholar, not an advocate on that, I defer to you, Yvin and Makennan, and to you, Mary, as a both scholar and litigator. The way I push back is through scholarly critique. So if anybody's interested in William English's work, go on SSRN, which is the free place where we academics post papers, and read the 20-page critique of his work that I posted there, showing what seemed to be some serious errors. And unfortunately, you know, his work has become enormously influential and cited in lots of places for propositions that I don't think it supports. So that's one. I mean, I could go on here, but I guess one just thing that I have spent a lot of time in 15 years trying to push back on is is a different kind of myth than the one that Professor McCord was mentioning earlier, but the myth that gun regulation is a new thing, that essentially that the Brady campaign invented gun regulation, that it's this new model, is absolutely false. Nothing could be further from the truth. Anybody who's interested in that history, please visit the repository of historical gun laws that we host on the webpage of the Duke Center for Firearms Law. It has now more than 2,000 historical examples of weapons regulations to show that, like, just as gun rights are in many ways deeply rooted in American history, so too is gun regulation. And the fact that people don't understand that, I think, leads to all kinds of problems.
Yeah, my comment would be transparency, right? We have issues, obviously, if it's not known about Professor English, if he is taking money from certain interest groups, that's something that you should know when you read his scholarship, right? Just like if a justice on the Supreme Court is closely aligned with a particular interest group or has accepted money from a person or group with a particular ideological perspective on things or a particular agenda, that is something that we should know about. To have faith in the integrity of our courts and our judicial system, that kind of transparency is important. And that is something, you know, we have seen, particularly with respect to the Supreme Court, public confidence in the court just plummet over the last couple of years. And I think that's something that they should be very concerned about. And transparency and an enforceable ethics code are both are important steps to take there.
I will say, you know, this one character, Professor English, I don't know much about him, but I can tell you he's one of many in a sea of people that have been recruited by the gun rights movement and by gun manufacturers themselves, and the NRA especially, over the course of decades to kind of promote this scholarship. And that's eventually what led to the individual right interpretation in Heller. You know, they, a lot of the justices called, Scalia specifically called on that scholarship from these people that were paid to write these kinds of things. And I think what's interesting here is this is a wedge where, you know, law students can get involved. This is a space that's rapidly developing where scholarship is constantly needed. I'm sure Professor Blocher would love to have some more friends and people in his classrooms. So I would say, you know, if you have an interest in this stuff, then devote your law school notes to it. Do something about it. You know, this is a really cool opportunity that we have as young people who are disproportionately affected by this issue to kind of use our work and our careers and our educations for the furtherance of this movement and this kind of work. So that's all to say that this has been such a great panel. I really appreciate everyone's time today. This was such an enlightening conversation, and as scary and daunting as it was also very hopeful. And I feel like we're all armed, for lack of a better word, with a lot of knowledge that we didn't have coming into this, and that includes myself. So I'm really happy that we were able to have you all here today. I do want to say that ACS will be making a recording of this panel available on their platforms. That includes their website, their YouTube, and their podcast. So if you would like, please go check it out. out and spread it to your friends who might be interested, because guns and democracy is a topic that really does affect every single one of us. With that, I'll let everyone get back to their afternoons, and I really enjoyed this. Thank you so much, Professor Blocher, Professor McCord, and Yvin for joining us today, and for ACS for hosting this.